Good morning everybody, welcome back to IndyCar on the 26th of October. Now, ferries. There's a lot of stories about ferries constantly on the front pages of British newspapers, mostly claiming that the SNP managed to botch the order for two ferries for Caledonia and McBrain. Now, you've all seen this story time and time again, that it was all Nicola Sturgeon's fault, it was the SNP's fault. Politicians can't be trusted with big infrastructure or big transportation orders and all the rest of it. However, an official report, an audit basically, into the goings-on during the commissioning and ordering process for the new Caledonia and McBrain car ferries has been published in the last few days, and it paints a much different picture from the way things are being presented by the BBC propaganda department at Pacific Quay in Glasgow, as well as the mainstream newspapers. And what's emerged from this report is that during the process, when the SNP government decided to give the orders to a Scottish civilian shipyard, which is exactly what it should do. I mean, we want these orders to be built here in the country where they're going to be used by people who know how to do it. It naturally was assumed that Ferguson's would be doing the contract, and of course they were given the contract. But what's not so widely known is that governments and politicians cannot themselves be responsible for commercial orders of this scale. So in order to accomplish the ordering process, a new legal entity had to be created, if you like, a go-between, a company which is not a company. It's, I suppose, a quango, a quasi-non-governmental organisation, an intermediary which is created for the specific purpose of ordering and also basically deciding what the design of the vessel should be. And that entity was known as CMal. That was the shortened version of it. Now, CMal wrote the contract. They also were responsible for setting the design parameters for both ships. And in these design parameters, the ships were to be a certain size, certain length, and a certain draft. That's the depth of the hull below the waterline. They were also to have a certain type of engine. And that design was largely well understood, and the design work was actually done by Ferguson's themselves. They knew what the ships were going to be. And Ferguson's had decided, in order to keep the costs down, to build both of the hulls side by side on the shipyard itself, on the slipway. That way they could build and fit out both ships on dry land where it's easier to do it, and then launch them one after the other to have them fitted out with all the equipment they needed for sailing. So basically all the passenger compartment stuff, the electronics, the control systems and all the rest of it, and obviously the decks and furniture and all the rest of that stuff. So that would have been fine, and it was fine for a while. But unfortunately, as soon as Ferguson's began to build the first hull, CMal, which incidentally was not entitled to do this under the terms of the contract, decided to change the design in the middle of Ferguson's having already started production on the first hull. And in doing so, they decided that they were going to change the engine. They wanted the engine to be able to run on different types of fuel. And they decided that they wanted Ferguson's to make these changes right now, at the time. But not only that, the change of engines was also accompanied by a change in the draft, the depth of the hull below the water. And this is a huge change to any ship design. Any marine architect will tell you, you're basically going back to the drawing board when you get a change like that. So these changes, which were made by CMal, not incidentally something they were allowed to do under the terms of the contract, caused Ferguson's to have to backtrack and change the way that they built the ships. And so they were forced to build one ship at a time. And in order to do that, that was going to slow things down. It was going to almost double the amount of time it would take. So in the process of trying to accommodate these rather ridiculous 11th hour changes that CMal had insisted upon, They ended up building the first ship first and trying to put these modifications in that ship. And that led to delays for the second hull. And the second hull had to be built empty, basically, with just its engine in, nothing else fitted at all, and then launched. And this is why there was such an enormous delay. This was meddling by the intermediary company which caused the delays in the contract. Now, I have said many occasions that politicians should stay out of the procurement business because it tends to lead to cost overruns. And I often use as an example of that what happened when the Scottish Parliament was designed by, who was it, Ernest Morello, or trying to remember the name. I probably got the name wrong. But anyway, the original design of the Scottish Parliament was smaller than the one we have now. But the politicians insisted that they wanted more space, they wanted more offices, they wanted more facilities, they wanted a bigger chamber, and so the whole thing grew arms and legs, and before you knew it, the Scottish Parliament cost 10 times the original estimate for what was actually built. And that really should have sent up warning signs to everybody that politicians shouldn't be allowed to meddle in these things, and people should not be able to change the design, which is already perfectly good. However, that lesson didn't seem to have been learned by CMal. On the other hand, I guess that the politicians, the Scottish Government, might have wanted to oversee this process a little bit more closely and monitor what CMal was actually up to, but they didn't do that. And I don't know why they didn't do that. But Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited were the people who ended up carrying the can for the mistakes made by CMal. And they've been largely lambasted as well by the British press. So as if the Scottish Government and the shipyard were actually responsible for the muddle that was created when it plainly wasn't. And the audit has already proved that. So the SNP had not caused this problem and still are not to blame directly for this. I mean, they could have employed a little bit more oversight of it, but that didn't happen. They trusted CMal to do the job. They had hired individuals who were eminently qualified, apparently, to commission the design and construction of these two ships. Unfortunately, they started meddling. They started doing the job of the shipwrights and the shipbuilders, and Ferguson's were unfortunately caught in the middle. So that is the first thing. So the ferry fiasco seems largely to have been caused by this intermediate entity, which is basically a weird way of saying a little company formed to actually order the ships. Now, other stuff has been happening as well more recently, and I noticed in the press today that Anas Sarwar was interviewed by the BBC News in London as a part of its political coverage of the soon-to-be-called eventually general election next year. Now, this is weird because Anas Sarwar was presented by the BBC as though he was the leader of the opposition at Holyrood, which of course he isn't, because Labour in the Scottish Parliament is the third largest party in that chamber, not the opposition. It's not the official opposition. And therefore, why was the BBC presenting Anas Sarwar's interview in London as though he had some kind of role to play in opposing the SNP in Holyrood, when he plainly hasn't got that job at all? He leads the third smallest party in Holyrood, or third largest party, sorry, in Holyrood. But then again, the BBC wants to present Labour in Scotland as the party of opposition. Because it's the party of opposition in London, it has to be the party of opposition in Scotland as well, according to the BBC. But of course it isn't. So Sarwar was given a soft interview in the limelight in London on the basis that he was somehow supposedly the leader of the opposition in Scotland, when he plainly isn't. But this is all about the BBC attempting to make sure that the Labour Party gets a lion's share of the TV time, because they see the writing on the wall for the Tories. And I remember the BBC is infested with Tory placemen at the moment. The BBC has placed all kinds of high-level management into the BBC with Tory placemen who are there to ensure that the BBC gives the Tory party an easy ride. But now that the BBC can actually see that Keir Starmer's leading in the polls, despite his obvious flaws, They've now decided to jump ship, abandon all their efforts to ensure that the Tories have an easy ride, and are now transferring their affections to the Labour Party in typical style of the BBC. They wait to see which way the wind's blowing and then decide to change tack. So Sarwar is being sort of feted now as a kind of Scottish opposition leader when he plainly isn't. And Sarwar, with the best will in the world, has nothing like the gravitas of most of the Scottish SNP and even the Green Party leaders. He just doesn't have that. He doesn't have that intellectual heft that these other party leaders actually have. Now, despite my misgivings about Humza Yousaf, I would probably class him well ahead of Anas Sarwar. Sarwar is a millionaire playboy. His father being a multi-millionaire. Sarwar's had an easy life, public school education, and yet he leads essentially what is meant to be a socialist party. He's a champagne socialist. He is in no way a working class hero, and he, I suspect, has been promoted well beyond his level of competence in the Labour Party. But that so often happens with political figures and parties. Okay, a couple of other things. The Chain of Freedom, which you may remember was such a massive success in Scotland, was somewhere, there's some argument about how many people showed up for this, but the estimate, which seems to be in the middle, is around about 40,000 people actually turned out on a cold day to join hands across the entire length of the Forth and Clyde Canal all the way to Falkirk, to link up, to form as much of an unbroken chain as can be managed. They almost made it. It was a difficult ask at the best of times, but the two women who were responsible for setting this up had no help. They had no funding and no official status. So to do this with so little was a remarkable achievement. But it's now been suggested by various independence activists in Scotland that this idea be exported to Wales. And the suggestion is that the organisers contact Plaid Cymru in Wales, the party of independence there, to help organise or to give them some pointers and assistance on how to organise a chain of freedom for Wales. To be fair, Wales has a very long land border with England, far longer than the one in Scotland, I suspect. And Wales has a smaller population than Scotland, I think something like 3.2 million people, if I remember correctly. So this is an even taller order for the people of Wales. Plus, finding a route for it might not be so easy. On the other hand, it may be eminently doable, and Welsh independence has taken a real uptick recently, and my friends in Wales who constantly keep me updated on the situation there say that support for independence in Wales is growing steadily as well, as they see the mess that the United Kingdom is descending into. One final little snippet that I saw on the internet this morning was, I think, an episode of Question Time or Scottish Questions, one of these debate night shows that the BBC so often likes to populate with English accents and Tories living in Scotland. There was one woman in the audience who lambasted the SNP because, although she was ostensibly an independence supporter, she said, well, you've had 5 mandates to hold an independence referendum and you still haven't done it. And the Scottish politician, I think, I'm trying to remember which woman it was who was actually on the panel. However, she was forced to answer that we have to live within the British Constitution. That was the answer. And coming from a Scottish politician, that's strangely ignorant of the fact that England doesn't have a written constitution at all, as a collection of customs and practices and prior legislation, which sort of bulldozed together into a heap are supposed to be this British constitution. However, she's right about one thing, and it was an admission that all the Scottish politicians of every party, including the SNP, the Greens, even Scottish Socialists, everybody who manages to get somebody elected to the Scottish Parliament, all those politicians are forced, and I use the word forced, to abide by this fictitious English constitution which doesn't exist, neglecting of course the fact that they have their own Scottish constitution which is still lawful and guaranteed under the Treaty of Union. It was the precondition. And yet our Scottish politicians still will not accept our sovereignty as people. And this has been annoying me for decades. It's been annoying everybody for decades. But it's annoying even more when you hear one of your own elected officials admit it, that we have to live with this British Constitution. Why? Why do we have to live with it? We're trying to free ourselves from this British Constitution in the first place, so abiding by its rules is very obviously not the thing you would do. However, if you want to keep your job in Holyrood, you can't do it because you've taken an oath to King and Country, and it's not Scotland's King and Country, it's England's King and Country, and you can't do anything else. So we're still stuck with it. However, it's nice to be able to debunk a myth today, at least, about ferries. And I sort of pre-blurbed this particular edition with, you know, a fairy tale. There are ferries at the bottom of our garden. And the ferries and the tales told by the BBC and the mainstream media are just that. They are fairy tales. It was nonsense. It was nonsense all along, and the official inquiry has proved that. The SNP was not responsible for what happened to these ships. That was the job of this entity. Excuse me using all these quotation marks with my fingers, but it's true. And so what now for the SNP? I think they need to come out of the blocks running, because this next general election is only good for one thing, and that's re-electing as many SNP and Green and Alba politicians as we can possibly get into Westminster, because we will need them a little bit later on when we do call our own independence referendum, because eventually we will have to repudiate the entire Union and the fictitious British Constitution, none of which applies to Scotland under the terms of Britain's own treaty with Scotland. They were the ones who agreed to the treaty conditions, and the treaty condition is that Scotland stays sovereign, its people stay sovereign, Scottish laws and its constitution remain intact for all time as long as the Union continues, and that is a condition which the British state likes to ignore and conceal from the rest of the population. Anyway, that's it from me today, but it's nice to be able to pick apart the baloney which is coming out of the BBC about ferries. And it's also nice to know that the chain of freedom is not just a one-shot wonder. And in fact, I think there might be another chain of freedom across Scotland, perhaps in the next year, one which is better organised. And if the Scottish Independence Foundation, SIF, has got any kind of integrity, it should be offering the two people who organise the chain of freedom as much help and financial funding as they need to organise something even bigger and more successful next year. That's it from IndyCar today. I hope to be back on your screens again in the next couple of days. In the meantime, please keep the donations coming. It's the only way I can keep producing content at the moment. Although perhaps in the next year, 18 months, things might change for the better. But we'll see. That's it from me today. Keep the faith as usual, and I'll see you again. Probably, the way things look, it might be Sunday. But I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.